Thanks to everybody for coming. This is my first time in Hong Kong. I flew in at 7 AM this morning after a midnight horror flight. So hopefully this makes sense. Who here has had anything to do with Haxe before? Heard of it? No? So a lot of people are going to be quite new. Cool. This is going to be an introduction. It's called Haxe as a better JavaScript, which if we were doing this talk a while ago, you might think Haxe is some new cool JavaScript language, but it's actually pretty old. I started using it in 2009 when it clearly was a better JavaScript. Who was doing web development back in 2009? A good number of you. Very cool. I don't know if you remember back then, instead of having imports and exports and common.js, you used to just like concatenate all your stuff with a shell script. Some people had grunt and things running back then, but it was pretty messy. Instead of having classes and interfaces, you had like just prototype-based inheritance. So if you wanted to do object-oriented stuff, your best form of linting might have picked up a missing semicolon or an undeclared variable, whereas at the time Haxe had a fully kind of safe type system. Back in the day, jQuery was all the rage. jQuery is not the rage so much anymore, but at the time, Haxe had great integration for that as well. The syntax was so bad that people invented CoffeeScript. Did anyone have the pleasure of using CoffeeScript? Yeah, a couple of people. That kind of died once they started getting better syntax into the normal JavaScript language. But back in 2009, things were weird. You had all these browser quirks, and Haxe had a good standard library that was cross-browser safe. And if you wanted to download something like D3 library, you didn't have NPM or whatever, you had zip files, and you go and you right-click and you download it and you unzip it, and then you put the JS file in. There was no NPM. Meanwhile, Haxe had Haxelib. So back in 2009, Haxe was clearly a better JavaScript, but it's 9 years later. Oh yeah, and it also didn't just do JavaScript, it did PHP and Flash and C++ and all this stuff. Haxe can compile to many things for those of you who haven't heard it before. It's this language that has many targets. But if you're looking at it back then, you would kind of freak out if you had to do a big project in JavaScript. Meanwhile, Haxe felt like a gift from a loved one. I like my emojis. And so this is why I started using Haxe way back when. But if you're doing it today, JavaScript's come so far, you might wonder, what's the point? ES6 is so good. Is Haxe just a worse JavaScript? Has it kept up with things? So if we were to compare things today in 2018, JavaScript has things like bundlers, like Webpack and Parcel, so you can have all your assets included, you can put your style sheets in. Haxe has that as well. You don't have to use it, but you can. JavaScript's got modern ES6 syntax. Haxe is kind of still more traditional. You don't have things like const and let. Their arrow functions is coming in the next major version of Haxe, which is currently in beta. And so we've been stuck with long function definitions, so it's feeling a bit older. You've got NPM and yarn now. You're no longer dealing with zip files, and Haxe can use those, but again, it's kind of like all the stuff that Haxe stood out for. These days, JavaScript does it all as well. And so even the universal write your code once, use it anywhere, JavaScript now has Node.js, it has React Native, it has all this stuff. And so you might be wondering, you know, JavaScript's awesome. Is Haxe really worth it if you're looking at it? Is there any reason to prefer Haxe to JS in 2018? Yes. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the things that I prefer. And I'm going to compare it not just to JavaScript on its own, but JavaScript assuming you're using things like Webpack and Babel and ES6 and maybe Flow or TypeScript and using all of those things. What do I like about Haxe? Sanity. I like that when I have an array, there are not a dozen ways to loop through it. In 2010, we had to do these for where I equals 0, I is less than my array.length. I thought, you know, we had to, I've got a syntax error in that example. Don't mind me. But that was the 2010 way, or you had the 2010 way using jQuery. At some point, for each became a thing, and you didn't need jQuery. But that was pretty cool, except it didn't work in IE8. And then there's like the modern syntaxes like for var item in my array, which feels like it's right, but it's wrong. For those of you who know JavaScript, that loops over the properties of the object, not of the array. And then there was var item of my array, which kind of doesn't read that well in terms of the way the English reads. Item of my array, I don't know. In would have been better, but once JavaScript has done something, you can't ever undo it because it's JavaScript. So mistakes are there forever. And then you have the problem with vars and lets and all that. Whereas Haxe, it's just like, it just got it right. It got it right 10 years ago. There's one way to do it. It's nice to not have to worry about the syntax quirks that are built up over time. So there's small things like that. There's also small things like, even with Flow and TypeScript, just yesterday, my team found an error in Flow where we had a switch statement, and if you switch and you say the case is something that's a variable, Flow no longer type checked that variable, and it's just all these holes in the type system, and Haxe doesn't tend to have those. If it's got holes, they're really weird esoteric ones that you would never run into normally. Whereas I feel like TypeScript and Flow, you're often still running into things. So sanity is one of my big reasons that I still love it. One of the other features that I really love is enums and pattern matching. Has anyone heard of enums? Yes, they go by different names in different languages. Who here has used React and Redux? Yeah? You might have done stuff like this where you've got an action with a type, and you say the action type is set age, and I want to set the age to 30. And then you go down and you have a handle action function which goes through, and you have to go, if the action type equals this, then do something. If it's something else, then do something. If it's something else. The way you can do it in Haxe is using enums, which is an enumeration of a set number of things. So if we have our actions like set name, and that takes a name, or set age, and that takes an age, those become values that we can actually say. So instead of having an anonymous object with magical strings, we can actually say age equals set age, and it's got the things in there. And then when we handle our actions, we can use a switch statement with pattern matching, and the compiler will be smart enough to let you know, to make sure that you're using everything in the correct way. You're not trying to pull age out of set name, you're not trying to pull a type that doesn't exist. If you add a new action, it will make sure that you handle it in your switch statement. It will give you an error if you choose not to. And so there's things like that which just make it really clean and really easy to refactor your code, really easy to improve your code and know everywhere where you need to update it. Once you have that, it's really hard to go back. It is possible to get this kind of stuff going in Flow and TypeScript, but I found it a lot messier and not as thorough in the way it follows through and forces you to keep all your code working. Some of the other stuff I love is zero-cost abstractions. So Haxe was built originally by a game programmer, and its biggest use case is still in the gaming community. And so they have lots of ways of making code that runs really, really fast. So things like, if you wanted a signal system, so not a full event thing with bubbling events that can be cancelled and whatever else. If you just wanted a simple thing where you can listen and subscribe to a single signal that's coming out, you can write these abstracts, and you get a nice API with a listen method and a dispatch method, and it behaves just like a class. So you go new signal, signal.listen, signal.dispatch, and it behaves like a class. But then when you look at the compiled JavaScript, it's just an array and functions. There's no class, there's no object allocations, there's no anything else. It's in the most primitive form that is the fastest in JavaScript. And so if you have something where you're going to have tens of thousands of objects looping through and executing stuff really quickly, these abstracts it's a way of having abstractions that make your code nice to write, but really efficient to run. So there's stuff like that. Another reason that I love Haxe. Then you've got a really good editor plugin. So who uses Visual Studio Code as their editor day to day? That's a decent number of people. I feel like Visual Studio Code versus Atom versus Sublime is the Vim versus Emacs of people who never learned the old school ways. But there's some really decent plugins that do stuff like they get the expected type from the compiler, and so you come in here and you go, we want a JSON module type, and it will automatically fill in all the expected fields that that object needs to have for you. So you don't have to go comparing the API docs every second. You just come, and as you go through, it fills out. And that stuff is provided by the compiler, so it's working in Visual Studio Code as a reference implementation, but it's quite likely we'll see this stuff backported into the other editor plugins as well, which is pretty cool. There's other things like completion, completion of overrides, so if you're overriding a function, it knows all the functions that are on the parent class, and then you choose it, and it just fills out all the types, everything. It's pretty nice. So there's some good reasons that there's some stuff in the Haxe ecosystem that makes for a lot of developer happiness. Another reason I love it. Then there's macros and metaprogramming. If you've come from C++ land, the word macros probably makes you go, ah! Like, no, this is a way to make code unreadable and impossible. But in Haxe, macros are a way of reaching into running code at compile time, but it's all type safe, and it's all, fully typed, and it's not just strings like going chop off this bit of the file and add a new bit in the file and do a regex change on this. It's actually all type safe, it's all properly passed, it's really cool. And it lets you do stuff like this. This is from a library called tink.json. Did you have a part in making this, Kevin?
Not really.
Not really. Okay. You were the one that showed it to me. So tink.json, imagine you've got a type, like just an anonymous object type called profile. It's got a username, it's got a date, it's got an array of the pets you have, because every website obviously needs you to list your pets. With the native JavaScript parser, if you said var profile equals haxe.json.parse, that would just do a standard JavaScript parse. And when it does that, it will put in whatever the object in the string was. So you could have data from something completely different. You could have your banking history, and it would just put it in there and you wouldn't know any better. With the tink.json.parse, it actually does a validating parser. So it looks at the expected type and it goes, I'm expecting a username, I'm expecting an account created at, and I'm expecting an array of pets. And it will make sure that those fields exist. And if it doesn't, it will give you an error and get you to handle it properly. And all that happens in a single line of code because there's this crazy metaprogramming stuff going on. And so you get some really cool chances to write some libraries that make your life much, much easier with much, much less effort. So yeah, that's things that I love. But if I'm honest, there's still things that I miss. At the moment, I work at a company called CultureAmp, and we don't use Haxe. So I used Haxe at a startup that I started, and I used it at another company I was at. These days I'm using it as a side project thing, but I'm working at a company that uses React with Flow and uses Elm. And when I come back to Haxe, the things I miss are things like Prettier. Who's used Prettier? Only a couple of people. Prettier is this amazing tool where you're going and you're typing your code in JavaScript and you've got bad formatting and you've got spaces all in the wrong place and you've got some tabs, some spaces. You've got some single quotes, some double quotes, there's no standardization whatsoever, and you hit save and your whole project suddenly looks clean and uniform. And you stop wasting time thinking about formatting. It's amazing. But Haxe doesn't have one of those yet, and I would like to change that. But for now, you've got to format yourself, which is sad. I use React a fair bit, and Haxe doesn't have real JSX, which makes me a bit sad. Standardized async stuff. So back in the day, everyone just used callback functions, and then promises came, and there was a few promise libraries, but JavaScript pretty quickly standardized on one way of doing async code, and now everything does it, and you've got Babel plugins that do async, await, and all this stuff, whereas Haxe has a few different promise libraries, and they don't interact that well, and so you kind of pick one. It makes me a bit sad. And then null safety is an interesting one because in almost every way Haxe is way safer than JavaScript. But I've noticed Flow, the type checker from Facebook, does a better job of checking whether you're using a null value in a way. Like if you try to call null on a method, the Flow compiler will complain, whereas Haxe at the moment doesn't, and that makes me sad too. So there's some good things, there's some things I miss. There's other competitors as well, like I mentioned we use Elm at Culture Amp. Has anyone heard of Elm? Elm is a cool language. It helps you get no runtime errors, it's got a powerful type system. The compiler errors, when you like do an error at compile time, are like the most helpful, friendly thing you've ever read. So they've got that, and it's got a built-in framework. It doesn't need React, it doesn't need Angular. Elm is its own framework and language in one. And the Elm architecture is really cool. It's basically, you have your model, which is the state of your page. So in a to-do list, you might have your list of to-dos and their completed status. You have an update function, which just is a way to add a new to-do item, to delete one, to toggle one, to change the wording of one. And then you have a render, a way to get HTML out of it. And the Elm architecture is really simple and really, really well suited to front-end web development. If you're doing front-end, this is a great way to think about your app. You think about what's the data I've got on the page, what are the actions that can change the data on the page, and then how do I render it? And this is what React Redux was based on. So Dan, whatever his name is, Dan Abramov. No, I can't remember if that's his name. Anyway, when he was building Redux, he said he was inspired by the Elm architecture. But what is not good about Elm is that it's so insistent on being pure and saving you from runtime errors that it's really bad at interacting with other things. So if you want to use a really common library like D3 to do some cool visualizations, Elm will force you to go through this thing called ports, and it means that you can't use the library in the way it was designed. And so it becomes impractical to use any NPM modules, which is a pretty big downside compared to using something like Haxe. Has anyone heard of ReasonML? Yeah, Reason is from Facebook. It's basically OCaml, which is the language Haxe was built with, and it's an awesome language, but Reason has JS type syntax, so it's easy to learn. It outputs native and JS code, and it works well with React. And so you might love it, and it's backed by Facebook, so you're like, yeah. But then the downside is it's backed by Facebook. And so this is where the history gets interesting, because Haxe was actually originally built by someone who made ActionScript 2 games back in the day. And he had built his own ActionScript 2 compiler and had made games and had thousands of lines of code in ActionScript 2, and then Adobe said, ActionScript 2 is dead, long live ActionScript 3. And he was like, I don't want to be beholden to corporates dropping support for a language and my code now being obsolete. I'm going to make an open source tool that is free for anyone and will outlive short-term corporate interests. And Haxe has lasted for a long time. It's been around since like 2004, I think. So it's like ancient in terms of compile-to-JS languages. I think it's one of the oldest ones. And it's just outlasted things like Dart. It's outlasted things like Google Web Toolkit. They're both Google examples. But I sometimes wonder if Facebook, like it already seems like their Flow project is beginning to lose momentum and they might be switching to Reason. I wonder if they will not switch to a new hotness at some other point. They've already changed the syntax for Reason and made it completely backwards incompatible. So it's like, if you're going to do that and jump on with a corporate thing, then you don't know if it will stay. Whereas Haxe sticks around. So before I was kind of talking about how great the Elm architecture is. So I'm just going to show you what that would look like if you're going to do it in Haxe. Using everyone's favorite little to-do example. First, you define a type def, which is basically saying this is an anonymous object that looks like it's an object with a field called to-dos, and that is an array of objects which have a task, which is a string, and a complete flag. That's the state of your page. And then you'd go, what are all the actions that we do on a to-do page? We might add a task, we might toggle if one's done or not, we might delete one. And you come up with your list of actions. These are the things that you can do on the page. And then you get your old state plus your action, and it gives you a new state. And so you have a function like do action. It takes your old state, takes your action, and it does something. If any of you have done like immutable JS, you'll probably be whinging at me for not using immutable, but That's just because it's a small example. But you go and you create this, and you use the pattern matching and the enums I showed you before, and this will make sure that you do it all right, that you make sure you cover all your bases and that everything is type safe. And then finally, you render it, and React is great at this, but you can use things like Vue, or you could roll your own, or there's other ways, other virtual DOMs that you can use. And so you render stuff based on that state. And this lets you do compiler-driven development. This is kind of like test-driven development where you write your tests and just try and get it green, but this is just my approach. Like if I wanted to add a new button onto this page, first I'd add a button in the view. You just throw it in the view and then you've got a button and it's like add a to-do item. And then you say, oh, no, in this example I'm saying clear all. So we're going to add a clear all button. So button, the name is clear all. We're going to put an on click, do action, clear all. And when we do that, the Haxe compiler will complain and say, clear all isn't one of your actions. And then we go, so we need to add clear all to our actions. And then once you add it to your actions, it will go, in your do action function, you haven't handled the clear all option. So in do action, you go case, clear all, and you just reset the array, empty it. And so when you're doing that, you're done. And Haxe have made sure that you covered all of your actions. You created the button, and then the compiler kind of hinted, this is the next thing you need to look at. This is the next thing you need to look at. This is the next thing you need to look at. And then all of a sudden, your code is ready. Compiler-driven development. I like it. So anyway, I've got just a few tips for people who have used Haxe. When I was using it at a startup a few years ago, I had this thing where I was like, Haxe is nice and pure, it's type safe, I don't want to use any of these other rubbish libraries that aren't as pure, I guess. I was a bit obsessed. And so I wanted everything I didn't use existing date pickers, I didn't use existing stuff, I wanted to rewrite everything in Haxe so it was nice and clean. But my tip would be, don't do that, just use existing libs. It's so much easier, and this is where Haxe really shines compared to something like Elm. You can just npm install something and you can use it, and you can write extern so it's got type definitions, or you can just use it with dynamic, which is kind of like saying in any type, so it doesn't do any type checking. So you just npm install it. There might be type definitions already available, there might not be, and then you require it. And I'm going to show you a demo. This is one I did where I included D3, and I had D3 installed with npm, and I had D3 installed there was like type definitions on HaxeLib, so I used them, and I was able to make a survey browser for my friend who did a survey of Steam developers. And so we had this thing where they all said whether they agreed or disagreed with certain things, and you could, whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed, and their circle would get bigger if they strongly agreed. And so you could kind of pick up the sentiment of the community by looking at it. And then you could look at how they responded to different questions. You could change the color coding to show different demographic information. And all of that was done with D3 and Haxe. But I could have used it just plain JavaScript, but it was so nice to have the D3 type definitions and just kind of work through, have the nice editor experience, have the nice way of working, know that my stuff is being checked each time. So that was great. Recently I did another one where I wanted to use map, and there were no type definitions for Mapbox, which I wanted to use. So I think I spent maybe 2 hours just creating an extern that covered most of the use cases, but I didn't want to spend like forever doing all the detail. And so I marked the rest of it as just dynamic, meaning don't bother type checking it. And that let me move really quickly, and I was able to build something that I was really proud of. So this is built, the bottom bit is like a scrolling menu built with React and a little npm that does an animated scroll to position. And the top bit is done with Mapbox. And yeah, I was able to put this together in just a couple of days. Because I was using existing type definitions, and because I didn't have to spend ages referencing the documentation and going, oh, I made a typo here, or I've forgotten what this function's called, because Haxe had all that stuff, and the compiler and the editor experience helped me through it, which was pretty nice. So, is there any reason to prefer Haxe to JS in 2018? I think there is. Things like type safety, developer experience, the fact that it's open software and it's not run by a corporation. Some see that as a downside, I see it as an advantage. And then it's got cool features, and then it can target other platforms. This talk has been all about JavaScript, but I've done stuff where I've had like a JSX syntax also compile PHP backends and things like that. You can just do whatever you want because it targets PHP and Python and Node.js and C++ and a ton of other things. It's a pretty cool language. I'd encourage you to have a look at it, especially if you've got a small project where you just want to play around. It's an easy alternative to something like TypeScript, and I think a better alternative. So that's my talk. Haxe as a better JavaScript.